Well, good morning, buenos dias. Thank you to all of you for showing up. It's so important at this stage in our lives. Sundays are one of my favorite times of the week. It's when I start my week, and I started here at Open Circle. And here I'm especially excited to be presenting, and also because this week we're getting air conditioning installed at our house. So all kinds of reasons to have a great start to this week. I especially want to thank you for showing up to hear about a topic that I have to make some upfront disclosures about. And I faced some challenges deciding to present today's topic. First, I had to create a title that would set this talk apart from the frequently espoused Open Circle topics around mortality, the meaning of life, and making the best of our golden years. This talk is not about these important issues, which are covered so effectively by several of you here in the audience today. Loretta, I think, is here. David, Kat, and others have done wonderful presentations about how we confront our later years and the issues of dying well, mortality. So that's not what I'm going to talk about. Secondly, when I originally wrote about this topic in Mexico News Daily back in 2018, I was confronted by reader comments that accused me of making light of a very serious topic and or misrepresenting the full weight of the homicide crisis that has been plaguing Mexico since 2016. 2006. 2006 is a critical year because that is the year that the Mexican government decided to bring the Mexican military into the streets to function as security officers and confront narco violence across Mexico. 2006. And the consequences of that have been devastating. And I'm not going to focus so much on that issue, but we can't discuss safety in Mexico in a vacuum and only talk about, well, we're just going to discuss how it impacts people from the US. That's not my intention at all. All human life has value, and Mexico is in an existential public security crisis that has torn apart families, communities, and Mexico's global reputation. I'm not minimizing homicide and missing person epidemic that has put Mexico on its knees. And as Mexico residents, this homicide and public safety crisis cannot be trivialized or dismissed. Public safety is one of our adopted country's many challenges. I don't want to underestimate that. And finally, Open Circle tends towards lighter and less controversial subject matter, and today's topic is certainly not. My fascination with Mexico and the topic of safety relates to my spending the better half of my last 40 years as a quasi-spokesperson on behalf of Mexico's tourism industry. From the mid-1980s until 2019, I worked on behalf of companies, so airlines, tour operators, hotel chains, destinations in Mexico, and Mexico's federal tourism ministry, educating travel agents around the world about selling travel to Mexico. And this work meant confronting head-on Mexico's #1 challenge and question for travel agents and their customers. And that question from decades back and is still today, is Mexico safe? In the 80s and 90s, the safety issue was always with us as educators, lurking behind these paradise portrayals of Mexico Beach vacation bliss. Back then, the obstacle that travel agents had to face head-on dealt more with public health, Montezuma's revenge, and with only a smattering of concerns about what is today a much longer list of reasons not to come here. Fortunately, I guess, assaults on your stomach have fallen from the hot-buttoned list of concerns, deprioritized by a combination of vastly improved sanitation conditions, better food handling protocols, and other hot-button topics, including today's topic, which are superseding travelers' diarrhea as a concern. So, by having to address the question of safety continuously as an educator in my career, I find it interesting to be able to study specific details related to Mexico and this sort of hard to define topic of, is Mexico safe? So let's get started. This is not a talk about Mexico's celebrated Dia de los Muertos, a ritual or how Americans come to retire in Mexico and forget to die. A few years ago, I came across the black and white statistics and details about where and how U.S. citizens meet their maker in foreign lands. You see, the U.S. State Department is required by law to report non-natural deaths by U.S. citizens in foreign countries. And the Foreign Relations Authorization Act of 2003 says that, quote, when possible, the Department of State must collect and post on the Department's Bureau of Consular Affairs internet site certain details about each U.S. citizen who dies in a foreign country from a non-natural cause. It requires, number one, the date of death, number two, the place of the death, and number three, the cause of death. If the death is due to terrorism, the report must say so. The website must list the information by country. It must cover deaths in the preceding 3 calendar years, and the information is updated every 6 months, unquote. So this is clearly a law enacted in the United States after 9/11, when there was heightened concern about the safety of U.S. citizens abroad because of attacks on the United States and attacks on citizens, and the whole response to that, to the terrorism acts of 9/11. So I'm not aware of any other country that does this. If there's any Canadians here who know that Canada reports how Canadian citizens die overseas from non-natural causes, I would love to look at that data, but I'm not aware that that exists. By the way, at the State Department website, there's also a tab that reads, quote, sending money to a destitute U.S. citizen overseas, unquote. So if you're ever having a really bad month, you can send people to the State Department website, send them a link, and maybe a shower of money will come your way from your friends and relatives up north. At the website, a simple online query with a date range and the country you're interested in yields a very antiseptic Excel sheet of the when, where, and how Americans die outside the United States of non-natural causes. This report, they don't detail whether these deaths involve folks living overseas or the casual visitor. As such, it does not reveal whether these poor souls were more or less likely to die based on their residency status, something I'd really like to know. Now, statistically, I suspect that living 365 days a year in an unsafe country versus a 4-night quickie vacation must work against being a resident, because you're exposed to these dangerous situations over a much longer period of time than a short vacation. But then again, living here and our aging bodies teaches us the 2 most important safety rules about living in Mexico. Rule number 1, and Kat, I want you to particularly listen to this, okay? Do not start a cartel. Are we clear on that, everyone? Okay. Rule number 2, don't be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Let's go. And fortunately, our sleeping needs as older Americans, Canadians, and people from around the world seem to take care of this one. And if you remember how your mom used to tell you, nothing good ever happens after midnight. And that logic does apply, because many of the non-natural fatalities that happen in Mexico are oftentimes because people are out and about doing things that probably their mother would have said, you shouldn't be doing that. But we don't go out much at night, and that's probably a good thing, because a lot of these incidents do happen after hours. So a little drilling and analysis of the data from the U.S. State Department reveals certain activities like swimming, driving, and yes, homicide and suicide that obviously impact traveling and living abroad. These figures also reveal some very glaring, in my opinion, media coverage omissions, which I will explain in just a moment. So our global village has some very tough neighborhoods, and Mexico is no exception. In fact, in the 2-year period, 2021-2022, exactly 1,100 U.S. citizens died of non-natural causes beyond U.S. soils. Now, surprisingly, this total is a dramatic reduction from 2014 and 2015, when over 1,700 estadounidenses, U.S. citizens, died overseas of non-natural causes. So 1,100 in the latest report, 1,700 in the report 5 years earlier. So I don't really understand why that is, although I suspect that it has to do with COVID. And let's say a blessing for those who died while overseas of non-natural causes. we have no doubt lost some talented ambassadors of goodwill. And let's pray that some of these fatalities were in the pursuit of happiness. Crossing a London street after a pint and looking the wrong way, or a sunset cruise, booze cruise, man overboard can at least be understood with a tinge of, oh well. More chilling, of course, and tragic are overseas homicides. And worldwide homicide of U.S. citizens fell significantly, okay, in the latest reporting period. So in the 2014-2015 period, homicides of U.S. citizens abroad were 339 in that 2-year period, and they fell actually down to 196, okay? And in fact, every category, I'll show you in just a moment from this report, experienced significant declines. And again, it's not easy to pinpoint why would fewer people be dying of non-natural causes, but I think, as I said, it has to do with COVID. And there's over 11 million U.S. passport holders who are living outside the United States. So, and that number continues to grow. So why fewer of us are dying of non-natural causes, I don't quite understand, but COVID probably kept us indoors and away from some potentially dangerous situation. So let's look at the report. And if I could have Isaias just flip the chart around here. I know it's going to be hard to see, but I figure it's better to take a stab at it, and I'm welcome to show you the statistics.
That's hard to see.
I know it is.
Impossible.
Thank you. Impossible. Thank you. But let's take a look at this report for a minute. So the State Department does divide non-natural fatalities into categories, which is kind of interesting. And the categories include air accidents, drownings, drug-related, not sure what that really is, maybe it's overdoses, homicide, maritime accidents, other accidents, don't really understand that one, we'll talk about that in a moment. And then when you get into vehicles, it breaks it down into buses, motorcycles, other pedestrians, trains, so all kinds of ways to meet your maker having to do with vehicles travel. And again, the global numbers here, 1,100 U.S. citizens died of non-natural causes overseas in this recent reporting period. Mexico had 393 of those incidents, which is 36% of the total. So Mexico detractors will paint that more Mexicans die of non-natural causes in Mexico than any other country. And this is true. 393 U.S. citizens' deaths of non-natural causes occurred in this 24-month period, which is 36% of the global total. Yes, more Mexicans die in Mexico, more U.S. citizens die in Mexico, but this is more a function, I think, of our visitation frequency and how personal safety in Mexico means avoiding certain places and situations. So, before you start posting on Truth Social, bear in mind that this singular statistic does not tell the whole story. And while this percentage of Mexico deaths compared to the rest of the world has risen, total Mexico deaths have fallen dramatically. So, non-natural deaths of U.S. citizens in Mexico in the previous period, 2014-15, were at 488. Okay? That number has fallen down to 393. So does that mean Mexico's getting safer? A 24% drop sounds like good news, but lurking behind these garish statistics are some troubling trends. The one that jumps out most to me is this category of other accidents. So this begs to me that the State Department probably needs to come up with some new categories instead of just pouring everyone into the bucket of other accidents. 64 fatalities in Mexico, and this is 38% of the global total. So one can only imagine what these accidents were. Two of them that I know are in these statistics are people falling off of balconies, reported on a fairly regular basis in resorts. Another one that you hear some very high-profile incidents around have been carbon monoxide poisonings, accidents, tragic accidents that happen in Airbnbs and VRBO home rentals, things like that. And maybe some of you have heard of other ways, with some of these other accidents might be that don't fit into one of these categories for some reason, but yet still have to end up in the report. And so I think it really indicates that the State Department needs to redefine its categories so that we can understand, what are these factors. There's probably one in here also that isn't spelled out and listed as other accident. And it's this crazy thing. A contractor in Mazatlan who used to write for Mexico News Daily reported on this contraption he had found doing construction projects in Mazatlan that were shower heads in bathrooms that had electrical cords attached to them. So you could heat your water through electricity while you're standing in the shower. So I suspect that may have be on this report somewhere. So let's focus in on the homicide figures. These can be startling in both ways, alarming, and believe it or not, for the casual beach vacationer, oddly reassuring. Even the bad news requires some contextual boundaries. Yes, Mexico accounted for 62% of worldwide homicides involving U.S. citizens, okay? Claiming 121 of the 196 victims over 2 years. So here's the category: 121 total homicides in Mexico. There are only 196 on the entire planet Earth. And then I've broken those down here, and we'll talk about this for a moment. I even see a hand going up back here.
Yeah, are these figures adjusted for the number of people are here?
No, these are not. Typically when you see homicide figures, they will be per 100,000. And believe me, when you do those calculations, statistics are really quite jarring in ways you might not realize. But no, they are not adjusted. These are raw figures. So this isn't percentages or probabilities or anything like that. So it's no surprise how northern Mexico and the border states, and there are 6 border states in total, these states are in a war with narco-traffickers who coveted transit routes to U.S. drug consumers. And this region, taken as a whole, accounts for 68% of the U.S. citizen homicides in Mexico. Okay? So Baja California, Sonora, Chihuahua, Nuevo León, Coahuila, Tamaulipas. Those 6 border states are part of the expression, the killing fields of Mexico when it comes to homicide, and specifically homicide impacting U.S. citizens. So very bad outcomes happen across this 2,000-mile line in the sand. Now, longer stay visitors and foreign-born Mexican residents, like many of us, we tend to stay clear of these 6 states, with an exception, and that is the state of Baja California, where there are thousands and thousands of U.S. citizens living in places like Rosarito, Ensenada, San Felipe. And it may or may not surprise you to learn that Baja California leads with the most homicide of U.S. citizens in all of Mexico. In Baja California, in this figure of 121 homicides, 37 of them happened in one state, and happened in the cities of Tijuana, Rosarito, Ensenada, just that northwest corner of Baja California state, which is, I think, pretty shocking. What's also shocking is that there is very scant media interest in covering the homicide of U.S. citizens in Mexican border states. When an American is killed at a beach destination, the alarmist coverage is loud and will lead to the State Department issuing travel warnings. But another shooting of a U.S. citizen along the border is shrugged off and ignored by U.S. media. I know this to be true based on my research. I'm an avid reader of the Los Angeles Times, having been born and raised in Southern California. And you never see any coverage, even though every month there are homicides involving U.S. citizens, and specifically in the region of interest to LA Times, which is northern Baja California. And these are never reported. There's also rarely coverage of border homicides in the broader U.S. media, with some exceptions. Also, a Google search of, quote, U.S. citizens dying of homicide in Mexico yields a very short list of media stories about specific homicides. So what fascinates me is, why is this? Is the question of, are you a U.S. citizen, answered by holding a U.S. passport? How many would agree with that statement? If you hold a U.S. passport, are you a U.S. citizen?
Yeah.
Of course you are, right? So why would it matter to the media where, as an American, you were a homicide victim? Why do certain cases get covered and become big national and international stories when most of these homicides are completely ignored? I can only assume that the lack of interest is tied to an assumption that this subset of US citizens is perceived to be less than worthy of attention, perhaps because of their likelihood of being of Mexican descent, non-white, and involved, it's supposed, in some dangerous liaison in a dangerous region of Mexico. If every US citizen were equally valued, where's the media coverage? Now, there are, of course, some cases that do infiltrate the US media cycle. And one very recently, in late April, you may recall, there were a murder of 3 foreigners in the Ensenada area. Now, one of the victims was an American and the other 2 were Australian. And this drew very prompt international media attention. There's also been a couple of other incidents in the last 5 years that have jumped to the headlines. One of them was in Matamoros in 2023, and this incident, you may recall, was a group of 4 people crossing from Brownsville into Matamoros. Their vehicle was immediately attacked, they were kidnapped, and 2 of those individuals were killed. The other 2 were released by the captors. And the third tragic event that did make US headlines was an incident in 2019 in the state of Sonora. And some of you may know there are numerous large colonies and communities of Mormons living in northern Mexico. And this was an incident where a caravan of 3 SUV vehicles, families moving from Sonora into Chihuahua, a very rural desert part of Mexico, to visit another community, and they were mistaken, stopped, and 9 of these Mormon US citizens were killed. And that, of course, did reach the headlines. This uneven reporting, though, I think broadly confirms a media bias, as all of the victims were ethnically non-Mexican. Now, until this event in Matamoros, I used to be able to say all these murder victims that were reported on were Anglo. Well, that's not true, because the Matamoros event did involve 4 African-American tourists who were going into Mexico for plastic surgery, and again, tragically, 2 of them were killed. The Ensenada incident, though, that just happened, did draw indignation from Mexicans. Not about the media coverage, but rather the speed of action by Mexican law enforcement. Okay? The case was investigated and arrests were made very, very quickly. Within days, they had this crime solved and the perpetrators were in jail. And this happened very quickly while tens of thousands of missing Mexicans and murder victims are essentially forgotten by the Mexican judicial system. So it begged the questions for a lot of Mexicans, well, why did you jump on and solve this case when tens of thousands of Mexicans are victims of homicide every month, and those basically never get investigated and certainly never get solved, or very, very rarely. As you head on a beach vacation in Mexico, the homicide figures at popular beach locations are also startling, but in a way most travelers would find hard to believe. Just 7 in total, okay, over a 24-month period. So those are outlined right here. So in my world of training travel agents, of course, most of these people are going on beach vacations, right? And I'm sure in their minds they're thinking Mexico's a bloodbath, and if you go on vacation, there's a good chance, you might not come home. But it's really remarkable. 7 fake homicides, okay, if that's what your fear is, in a 2-year period. 2 of these happened in Puerto Vallarta. I don't have the details of who they were or what happened. And 5 of them happened in the state of Quintana Roo. Quintana Roo, of course, is Cancun, Playa del Carmen, big security problems there, and then this emerging area of Tulum down south where there's some high-profile homicides in that region as well. So in this same reporting period, 2021-2022, over 45 million US citizens traveled to and from Mexico via airplane, according to the US Department of Commerce statistics. So you do the math around the likelihood of being a homicide victim while in a non-border beach vacation, and the stats tell us the odds are overwhelmingly in your favor. Now, I have a portion here that I decided last night I wasn't going to read because I felt it, again, put too much focus on the only thing that's important is if you're a U.S. citizen. Those are the people that we have to pay attention to, whether they're homicide victims and not the broader conditions here in Mexico. But I'm going to read them to you anyway, because I think this can help us. Because all of us living here are to some degree ambassadors for Mexico, right? And on a regular basis, we have to defend our choice to live here and enjoy this wonderful country. I was just on a 15-day cruise with my partner, Roseanne, and of course on a big cruise ship you sit down at dinner every night, and the first question they ask you is, where are y'all from? And you could just see the expression when we answered, we live in Mexico. And it didn't get much better when I decided, well, let's not tell them that anymore. Let's tell them, we're from California. That didn't go over very well either. The first thing that pops into everyone's minds when they hear you live in Mexico is either are you crazy or do you feel safe? So I think it's important that all of us are armed with statistics like this, okay? 2-year period, in the places that people go on vacation, there were 7 homicides. And conceivably 40 to 45 million U.S. citizens in these physical locations. So here are the stats. In the U.S., in a typical 2-year period, there are about 45,000 homicides. Okay? With a U.S. population of 331 million people, this means that you had a 0.0135 chance of being a murder victim in the United States during these 2-year period. Okay? Well, one could draw the conclusion that as a U.S. citizen, you are 70 times more likely to be murdered in the United States than you are in Mexico. And if you don't live in a Mexican border town, say you live somewhere like Ajijic, you are even safer. Your chances of being murdered in Lake Chapala is 218 times less likely than living in the United States. Now, of course, this argument wouldn't have gotten me anywhere on the cruise ship, but it just does point out how poisoned Americans have become to the realities of safety in Mexico, at least for this cohort here of foreigners living in the country. By the way, Lake Chapala is part of this reporting, and I have the report right here. You're welcome to come up and look at it. This is all 393 incidents reported by the State Department. And Lake Chapala is involved. There are 5 mentions in the Lake Chapala area of this report. And some of you may have known these unfortunate incidents or even the individuals involved in this, and my condolences. There was 1 suicide. How tragic is that? There was 1 other accident. There were 2 automobile fatalities, and there was 1 pedestrian death that happened right here in our community during this reporting period. So very, very sad indeed. So is Mexico safe? The hundreds of thousands of us who call it home look at safety through a different lens, I would argue. Is it safe to drive a car in Mexico? Well, not really, especially not at night. Well, how about riding a bike? You know, I wouldn't say it's completely safe. All right, what about walking on the sidewalks? No, not always. So accidents happen, and some of us are luckier and smarter to avoid being in the wrong place at the wrong time. We also, let's remember, as a cohort of foreigners living here, have the advantage of relative wealth that affords us better living conditions than our Mexican neighbors. So in closing, should we take these statistics and conclude, well, as an American, I'm not really at much of a risk, so let's order another round of mimosas. Personally, I say no. The State Department report says little about a country's broader public safety conditions. And U.S. citizens in Mexico have the luxury of living where they want and picking up and leaving. And this is a marked advantage most Mexicans do not enjoy. And as residents of Mexico, we can't be dismissive about the public security crisis Mexico is enduring. And on this historic Election Day. And I did not connect the dots that I was giving this talk on such a profound date in Mexican history until much later. But on this historic election day, let's hope Mexico's new female-led government will tackle public safety crisis in ways that include institutional reforms, a demilitarization of policing, and far greater North-South hemispheric cooperation. Thank you very much.
That was good. Questions? If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. I'll bring the mic to you, and if you would stand up, if you're capable of standing up, and ask a question.
You are incredibly eloquent. Thank you. Someone else intimated this, and I really, there are more people who visit Mexico from the United States and live here than I think any other country. So of course our statistics are going to be off the charts. Have you done any sort of comparison to say, okay, yeah, there's this many, deaths in, unnatural deaths in Mexico, but per capita to me is the telling statistic.
Right. And I've not done those, but I think the numbers, as you said, are so glaring that you have to, even people who have doubts about these very statistics, you have to put it in the context of how many of us are roaming around down here. And a lot of us are roaming around here doing some kind of unsafe things. The statistic here that's also pretty shocking, I think, are drownings, okay? So 43 people drowned in Mexico in this 2-year period. And this is a symptom of, no lifeguards, alcohol, and people doing some pretty unsafe things, and in swimming when they probably don't have the, the skills to be in that setting. So I don't think that most of our friends up north appreciate that there are tens of millions of us here on vacation every year, and that depending on whatever figure you want to use, there could be as many as a million U.S. citizens, living in Mexico. And we're living in all 32 states of Mexico, and that certainly, living here 365 days a year, puts you, makes you exposed to some of these things that are appearing in these statistics here. But this other accidents one, that one really jumps off the chart at me, because we all realize in our daily lives that we encounter things that just aren't safe and that don't fit in these categories, but had to go somewhere, and that's where they get all poured into that bucket. Yeah. Question there in the back.
Okay, some of the cases that you mentioned in Matamoros was drug related.
Yes.
The one in Sonora, the family were abusing the community, having a lot of wells, and it was cartel related. But I wonder what is safer, the United States or Mexico. If a person has a felony, cannot vote and cannot join the Air Force, but for president.
Well, this topic of is Mexico safe is, again, as I said, I've been wrestling with for decades, because you have to get up front travel agents and try and convince them that they shouldn't be afraid to send their clients to these places. And I think for me, what it comes down to is what Americans are afraid of is the concept of what happens if something goes wrong. They feel like no one's got their back. There's a corrupt police force, there's a judicial system that does not, investigate and solve crimes, and who is going to come to my rescue if I have an incident? And so many Americans will go, the hell with it, let's go to Maui. It's just easier. Who wants to go on vacation and then have this back of your mind, if something happens, who's going to come to my rescue? I think that's the real deterrent. I don't think people go on beach vacations expecting to, not come home, but because we grow up in an America where, since little kids, we are bombarded with images of Mexico, and it's hard to make your way into adulthood and let go of those images. That comes from cartoons, from Western movies, from incessant media coverage of bad things happening in Mexico. And so it's very hard for even logical, normal Americans to wrap their mind around this idea that you would want to live in a place like this. And again, I don't want to divorce the US numbers and go, this is the only thing that matters. It doesn't matter. What matters is the bigger security picture, but we are not in those situations, and we are not in those scenarios. We are not targets of the cartel. And because the cartels, in my opinion, know that the last thing they want is the DEA and the FBI down here investigating, you know, the murder of US citizens, and that will happen. But this border thing is curious because there are dozens and dozens of US citizens being killed on the border, and they never get reported. And I think what happens is a news media report comes out that says Pedro Gomez died of homicide in Mexico. The assumption of the US media is, well, he must have been Mexican, why are we going to report on it? It's only after the fact that it's found out that Pedro Gomez was a US citizen. But by then, it's an old story, and it never appears in the US media, unless people are Anglo or they're coming into Mexico as tourists. In that case, there's a chance they will be covered in the media. But I think it's kind of shocking that those stories do not get covered. Yes, sir.
Wait.
I'm going to offer only. There was an incident around here involving two cartels a number of years back. And I would just like to say what happened during that, because make people here feel a lot better. Is that okay?
Well, we're supposed to take questions, but Kat,
Well,
comment, quick comment.
Can you make it quick?
yeah. Anyways, what happened is two gangs, cartels, started fighting over the carretera, basically, as a place to move drugs.
Yeah.
And they started fighting. And all of a sudden, the Navy, the Army, the state police, everything showed up.
Yeah.
They plugged off out that way and out that way, so no one could come in and out without going through a check place. And it took less than a week, and it was all cleaned up, and no expat was affected at all.
Yeah.
But that's a special case here because they know that they weren't just wanting it for that, but the gangs also know that if they start killing expats, Americans, Canadians, that they're going to leave.
It's okay to kill the French, though.
Yes, Kat, right here.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for all of this information. As an avid swimmer, I was very interested in the swimming statistics, and if there's any place that breaks down, whether they were ocean, pool, or lake
Yeah,
incidents.
right. There's not, because I assume some of these are swim-up bars in Cancun.
That should have its own designation.
Exactly. It probably does deserve its own designation. But no, it's not, there's no designation. You can look at the states where they happen and assume they were in the ocean, but they could have been in swimming pools too. Yeah.
The United States put out non-travel for American citizens to certain places in Mexico.
Right.
So, does that affect the number of people that would come and the number of people who would be in that pool of deaths?
Well, I would argue it does not, because Mexico breaks visitor records every month coming out of COVID. And Mexico, as you know, stayed open during COVID. So Mexico's visitor industry was not nearly as impacted as places in the Caribbean, Hawaii, places around the world. So I think it gives fuel to people who are Mexico doubters and people who have been here, and let's face it, many Americans have been coming to Mexico for leisure purposes for decades, and they understand the risk, the reward, the realities on the ground, and they read those and go, whatever, it's not going to impact me. Yeah.
I had looked up the stats for per capita information, and as always, it's sometimes tough comparing residents of the United States versus people down here because we're here part-time or tourism. But roughly it was 63.4 homicides per million in the United States, and it was 1.4 here for US citizens.
Yeah, the numbers are shocking, but I'll repeat it again. I don't want the takeaway from this to be that we should only care about what's happening to us because we are fortunate to hold a U.S. passport. This is a crisis in Mexico. We can only pray that the conditions are going to improve. And there's a special burden that U.S. citizens have also in this security crisis in Mexico, and that is that 75% of the guns used in homicides in Mexico are illegally brought from the United States into Mexico. The drug corridors that are being protected and why northern Mexico is so much more dangerous is because they are trying to access the U.S. market of drug users. And the money that's generated from these billions of dollars of substance sales in the United States are flowing back into Mexico and fueling the strength of these, criminal syndicates, these cartels. So the U.S. is hardly can look the other way when it comes to this horrific crisis that started in 2006 in Mexico, and there's no sign that it's going to get any better in the near term.
Anybody else?
Okay.
Thank you so
Great.
much.
Thank you very much.